And we're live, I think. I'm going to take these off. Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for the first event on the South Asian Heritage Month literature program. And I am very, very, very pleased to introduce you to our
lost this.
Yeah, I can't hear Natasha. Natasha, I can't hear you.
I think you're on mute.
I think she's on mute.
Bear with us.
Bear with us for 1 second. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Hello. Can you hear me now?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, lovely. I'm so sorry about that, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. This is our first event on the literature program of South Asian Heritage Month, and I'm really, really, really pleased to introduce you to all of our wonderful panelists. And our event is called Rise of the Bookstagrammer, and we'll be exploring the curated online communities of South Asian literature audiences and people that want to engage with South Asian stories. And we'll be looking at that through the lens of curators of these spaces, but then also through the lens of writing and creating work, and through the lens of the artist as well, reflecting back into those spaces and how that relationship works. And then we'll be having a wider discussion about what this then means really for the face of the publishing industry and how we can then collectively engage. So we have Mishika Narula and Shri Ramesh joining us from Brown Girl Bookshelf on Instagram. And we have Ali Araf, founder of South Asian Bookclub. And we have the wonderful Sabba Khan, graphic novelist and author of The Roles We Play, fantastic book that you should buy immediately. Thank you for joining us, guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you. Glad to be on here.
So Mishika and Shri, thank you especially as well. You're joining us from America, so I know that the time zone issue has been a tricky one, but we do appreciate your time. Can you tell us a little bit about Brown Girl Bookshelf? How did it come about, and how did you start it, and what was the ethos behind it?
Sure. I'll start with an introduction. My name is Mishika Narula. I'm based out of Chicago. Shri and I started Brown Girl Bookshelf together on August 26th in 2020. I'll let Shri tell the story of how we kind of came about, but essentially Shri and I know each other from college. We are both avid readers, and we spend a lot of time talking about the books that we read together. And so Shri texted me one day, and she'll probably kick off the story, but that kind of text spiraled into what you now see as Brown Girl Bookshelf.
Yeah, thanks, Mishika. Hi, everyone. I'm Shri. And yeah, as Mishika mentioned, we started Brown Girl Bookshelf last year. It started off actually with just a text. In the US at the time, there was a lot of conversation and movement around racial inequity. I think that was happening in other parts of the world as well. And that really started getting me, and I think Mishika as well, thinking about how diverse our reading was. And previous to that, we had just always been discussing books and things that we were reading whenever we were catching up. So I texted her one day to ask if she followed any accounts that shared more diverse reading, as I wanted to diversify the authors and to read more authors of color just broadly. And when she said no, we were kind of like, there should be things like that. We clearly we didn't know at the time that there were several other accounts, but that's kind of what was the genesis of starting this page. We honestly just thought it would be sharing books with our friends and family as we found more and did a little bit more active effort into searching for authors of color. And I remember when we got our very first a person that we didn't know following us, we were like, oh my gosh, someone random followed our account. And so here we are today with a much bigger following than we ever expected. Through that process, also sort of focusing in on South Asian authors, which really came about because as we started being in the Bookstagram world, we noticed that there were voices that were that were sharing books by Black authors, by Indigenous authors. We certainly didn't want to take up that space either, as that wasn't really our own voice. And so as we started thinking about that some more, we started focusing on like both of us being South Asian and really quite different in our experiences as South Asian as well, and our identities within the kind of broad umbrella of being South Asian. So we thought there was a lot more to do there about sharing stories by South Asian writers.
That's incredible. So you said that it started about a year ago, and I've noticed that there has been a lot of people experiencing this similar journey of decolonizing their reading list and decolonizing their bookshelf that has coincided with this new era of a new civil rights movement that we're in, almost, that started with really during lockdown and the murder of George Floyd. And it's something that has been, we're in an age of social reckoning, aren't we? And it does seem that a lot of people are so keen to learn about other worldviews and look at other perspectives and reframe so many things. And have you found that, you said there are other people doing similar things. Have you been connecting with those other accounts? And is there, how aware of the network around you are you, and do you engage with them often?
Yeah, on that vein, I'll actually say that before even looking at kind of the exterior audience, just internally, I think the precedent when a lot of people think about Brown Girl Bookshelf and then just think about Shri and myself is that we read really diverse books, and it's always been that case. But I will say that creating Brown Girl Bookshelf has actually altered what I pick up to read. I'd say prior to starting Brown Girl Bookshelf, really anything that had pages and was just sitting around, I would pick up and just ingest. But since creating BGB, I've been more conscious of what it is that I'm picking up, specifically gearing towards South Asian writers. Prior to BGB, I would really just focus on BIPOC in general without going into a lens of South Asian specifically. So I'd say it has changed my reading habits, but then also we've been able to connect with a lot of Instagrammers who are kind of making similar strides to us, maybe not just focusing on South Asian, but Black and Indigenous voices. And so they've found us and we've found them through the process of just liking and sharing resources and sharing material and resharing content. And so I think the online community has just been really supportive, which is probably why we've been able to grow at the rate that we have. Without their support and their likes and their reshares, we probably would have a much smaller audience at this point. So yeah, I'd say that there are a lot of really interesting users doing great work on social. It's just harder to find us. I think because we don't necessarily get the same attraction as some other larger bookstagrammers. So you really have to go digging for those that are focusing on the niche voices. But once you find them, I mean, we're all pretty interconnected and we do share each other's content. So it's easy to keep up.
I love that it's a community within a community. And I think it's so powerful what you said as well, because this is community led, and it really is, it's a testament to the fact that there is a need for this. There is an audience that is hungry to engage with this. And if there wasn't, then this wouldn't function at all, would it? And like you said, it's grown so quickly. And similarly with you, Ali, I know that South Asian Book Club as well is it's something you started over lockdown also, and it's just grown exponentially within that time.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of similar story to Brown Girl Bookshelf as well, of wanting to explore that writing from that region much more in depth, kind of getting both from the region itself and a lot of what I feature in my page is from the diaspora, and especially like the UK writers in the UK, just because that's my own background, so I'm naturally more interested in it. And yeah, I think the fact that it has grown way more than I expected. I know, Mishiki, you said similar, that it does show what you're saying, Natasha, that there's an audience out there. People want to see these things, and perhaps there was a gap before of like there weren't that many places where you'd see all this literature gathered in one place, and now there are a lot of accounts doing that. So that's something that's changed only in the last 2-3 years maybe. So there's definitely a hunger. I think people want to read more widely, and we're playing a small part in advocating for that. So been good. Yeah, it's been positive.
I would argue you're playing quite a large part in advocating for that, because I mean, no, but you are, because from an industry perspective, this is a community that no one had eyes on really before, and this was a community that no one really considered as a book buying, story consuming community at all, and so really we weren't engaged with as readers. And we haven't been engaged with as readers. And so our patron this year is on the lit side is Nikesh Shukla. And in our sort of brief opening video that we had where we had a conversation, he was saying this as well. And him and I were talking about this as well. And he was really excited about the things that you guys are doing, because it's so, so important. It is so key to the fact that it is tangible. It is a testament to the fact that the readership is there. And prior to essentially these grassroots curators, which is what you are, it's an extraordinary thing that you're doing. This entire populace was just scattered. And it's similarly with South Asian Heritage Month. What we were doing when I was speaking to people in the lit sphere, they all felt very scattered, and they felt as though they were doing what they were doing alone. And sometimes it takes people to just sort of gather things together, and then pool their resources, and then for other connections to be made and other people to start pooling their resources. And that's how we slowly start moving towards change, I think. And there are tangible shifts. And so Sabba, for example, you are an exceptional graphic novelist, if I may say so myself. I've been a fan of yours for a very long time.
Thank you.
So can you tell us a little bit about how you started sharing your artwork, and what the Instagram community and Bookstagram, what role that's really played in your process?
Yeah, it's really interesting as you guys are all talking and, you know, just reflecting on the power of the social media platforms. I really see loads of parallels in a lot of other industries as well. And I think it's probably because I came from another industry and I was just like, what's going on? That I, you know, kind of looking at me and my baby role in publishing and being an author. Really was about trying to make connections for the first time and coming into it like not really knowing other authors and other writers, and it was really just the only available platform for me that I started to go into and then use. But what I was going to say is that when I was doing architecture, I had a very similar experience where I felt really isolated at university and in office. And it's only in the last couple of years, similar to publishing, where you're starting to see Black and brown voices in construction, in design, that are calling for change and calling for conversations around race and equality and all of that good stuff. There's groups that are looking at that are very specific and very niche, so like Muslim female Black architects. There's a group that are now there, and I see them and I'm literally like, I'm shaking and I've got goosebumps, and I'm just like, oh my gosh, if this was me as a student looking at this group now, I'd be so much more confident. I'd be so much more, you know, I'd have such a more ambitious scope of what I could achieve as a person. And I feel like that's what we're offering to the younger generations, that possibility and that dream that actually these things are happening. We are all here and we're connecting with each other, and there's strength in the fact that there's numbers across the city, across the country. You know, there's the local, then there's the national, and then there's the global, the international, and that's really, for me, you know, I'm talking about architecture because that's the industry that I've come from, and that's what's most familiar to me, and what, you know, really sort of riles me up, because that was when I was at my most vulnerable, I think, in that industry. But definitely you're seeing it in publishing now as well, and that's what's really exciting. And I think for me, moving into publishing, it's been really amazing, like contacting Ali and talking to Mishika and Shri, and, you know, just having these conversations about my book and feeling that power and feeling that confidence that I'm not on my own. It's not a solitary endeavor. It's amazing. It's incredible. We need to keep going and keep sailing that ship.
I definitely, yeah, like this. There's been a community around it, hasn't there? And I know we mentioned publishers and industry here, but I never had that in mind when I made my page. I don't know about you guys in the States, but it was the community and the grassroots that I cared about, and I wasn't really targeting industry at all. And that's, I think, shown itself, as
That's
Sabba
why it
saying, like,
works.
yeah, but that showed itself. Like, you meet other people who are into the same thing. You know, you create connections, and you connect the dots, really, and from there a community grows. And I think that's way more important almost than publishing figures. But that's my opinion.
And that's where the energy comes from as well, isn't it? Sorry, Natasha.
No, I was probably saying exactly the same thing you were. Don't worry.
That's where the energy comes from, right? It's 100%. Just like, actually, we're not trying to be the next. I mean, essentially, it's disrupting the industry. It's actually, here's an industry, and it's got the hierarchical, elitist structures that come with it, with, you know, sort of colonial empire, whatever, and it's got that legacy, and we're actually like, don't give a shit about that. What we're connected, what we're focused on is connecting to each other and supporting each other, and there's a real fire to that, and passion.
I think that's the reason that it functions so effectively, because it is 100% authentic, 100% authentic. And I think it's interesting that you say I literally have post-colonial legacy written down here. This is why I love Sabba. But all of this feeds into, in my view, post-colonial legacy. So much of it does, because we are still, that reverberates through time and through every way we engage with society today. But particularly when we're talking about creative spaces and the world of imagination, which is still so heavily legislated. And so our lit theme this year is, what world are we reflecting back to children through our stories, and what then does this tell them about what they can dream for themselves? Because when we look at the world of imagination, where anything should be possible, and you aren't seeing versions of yourself that are the main character, that are the romantic lead, that are the hero of that story, that is not riding a big giant dragon taking over the world, or even just in a position of power, or even just doing normal everyday things that does not involve you propping up somebody else's goal in that story, where you don't have autonomy as a person in that story, as a person of color, as a South Asian person in that story. What then are you telling? What coded messages are you telling a child about what they can then, where they can place themselves in the real world, in the physical world? And we are a product of that messaging. Our generation is, and generations that have gone before us. And so what we're keenly aware of now, I think, is that we don't want that to persist. And so we are making this, and we are creating this new world to reflect back to the younger generation, which includes a true and complete picture about our history, which includes frank and open discussions about vulnerability and grief and all of these difficult things that we used to fold up and pack away, and we weren't allowed to talk about when, you know, through different aspects of culture and what have you. And that also includes whoever you might want to be, whatever you might want to do, and whoever you might love. You are accepted, you are wanted, every version of you is loved and belongs here. And that's, I think, what collectively, what we're all, in some unspoken way, we've all decided to work towards together. So that I think our generation had to learn to love ourselves in spite of so many things. And I think what we're all sort of driving towards is so that the generations after us are just, we reflect a world back to them that just lets them know they are loved, if that makes sense. And
that's,
I think
really beautiful. Yeah. That's literally, I feel like you've summed up what I was trying to get across with my book as well. I'm just thinking back to the voice that I sort of ended up creating for my mum in the book. My mum features heavily in the book, and I put in a lot of historic stuff and a lot of historic critique and reflection through her voice and through her character, and inadvertently created someone who's incredibly powerful and knowledgeable. And I mean, she is incredibly powerful and knowledgeable, but it's kind of repackaging it and having it as a vehicle, and as a character, a solid character in the book. And that's really, you know, and it's amazing, because I think I look at my mum and I'm like, yeah, you would, you know, if you had access to education and the internet when you were younger, and, you know, if you were able to form all of these opinions at a time when you could, and have the space away from, you know, arranged marriage and all those structures that have actually, you know, limited her. It's almost like this futuristic storytelling of the past, and it's, you know, it's really powerful, and I think that's where, yeah, you sum it up really well. I don't want to repeat it, because it's exactly that. It's like, what are we actually passing down? What is the essence? What's the feeling? You know, is it strength, or is it shame? You know, is it guilt, or is it, you know, like actually power, and you know, galvanizing our experiences to something where we can like reinforce each other. Yeah.
It's an interesting thing, isn't it? And I think all of the work that you're doing, it's something that started and that came out of passion and interest and all of this stuff. But what it has become, it's extraordinary. This is some kind of alchemy. Genuinely, I find it staggering. I really do. When I look through your pages and your community and the things that you are just saying, and you're saying them because you're interested in the books that you're talking about, because you care about sharing these book recommendations. Ali, the detail that you go into on your posts, you know how to sell a book to me that I know nothing about, and I'm like, oh my god, I think I'm in love with this book, I need to buy 5 books, why are you doing this to me? It is incredible, and it's just pure passion, and you are sharing that with so many thousands of people, and I don't even think that we can fully grasp the reach that has, and the ways in which that can make people feel seen and heard, and quite how necessary that is, because I think we're getting comfortable in our bubble of the world is at the end of your, you know, in the palm of your hand in your smartphone, and I think sometimes we forget quite how disconnected people are. And it's when I go and speak in schools and stuff, and I go, hey, does anyone know what partition is? And no Asian kids know what it is. Or do you know who Noor Inayat Khan is? Or do you know who these writers are? Never heard of them. And I think we are now entering spaces where this is becoming our normal, and it's lovely. But there's so many children out there, and there's so many people who are part of the diaspora that still don't know. So I love that there are people like you. I love that there is a inadvertently, and not that you've done it on purpose with the industry in mind, but there is a body of work here. There are tiles and tiles and tiles of your passion and of your commitment that people can scroll through, and you've got it all for them. And it is just love and effort and care and commitment, and it's gorgeous to see all these parts of who you are and where you came from reflected back at you. Honestly, the power of it's something so profound. It genuinely is.
I don't know how to react to that. That was really nice, Vicky. And yeah, like, applies to everyone here. I think what you said is important about it's genuine, and it comes from our own interests and our own passions. It's not contrived. And when you do that, it can only lead to, yeah, as you said, like, people being interested and taking recommendations on board and stuff. Especially as history, you said, features so heavily. Like, I'm actually interested to ask the girls in the States, like, how you relate to history in that way, because for us, being in the UK, kind of the empire and the legacy of it's very, like, in our face, like, all the time. It's present, but perhaps less so in the US. So I did wonder, yeah, how do you approach that kind of British colonial heritage, not living in the UK or not being from there?
Yeah, Yeah, that's a really great question. You know, I was just thinking the other day, this is maybe somewhat related, of like, what does it mean to have Indigenous voices? In the United States, of course, there is the Indigenous Native American community that has a voice, and that is a big part of the conversation. And in the UK, obviously, that Indigenous communities in the UK look a little bit different. And then for us, I think, as far as South Asian, I wouldn't say that, at least for us in Brown Girl Bookshelf, we're not constantly thinking of it from a decolonial perspective, because we're not, as you said, like so close to the colonial empire or anything. But I do think like you can see influences, whether or not we're using that exact language. There is so much kind of embedded in our history here with colonists, with the ways that people of color have been treated, with slavery as being a big part. And then we, of course, then with slavery get into the issues of model minority, which I'm actually not too familiar if that exists as much in the UK. But in the US, that is a big conversation around kind of the hierarchy of people of color and where South Asians fall in that, given that we came to the US largely, and majority of the conversation as well around South Asian immigrant communities are of people who came with what we have of H-1B visas, which are highly skilled worker visas. And so all of that, I think, is part of the conversation, which ties back into the ways that starting off as a colony and the ways that people of color have been filtered through our history as part of the conversation. But you're right in that I don't think it's as strictly tied to the British monarchy in the way that it might be in the UK.
So how are you finding, with that in mind, how are you finding then what you are leaning more towards in terms of what you explore? Because with Ali's page, there's a great deal of focus on history, and there's a great deal of focus on empire.
Yeah.
But in terms of what you guys are exploring, what have you found has been, what are you drawn towards the most?
Yeah, I think identity is probably the key theme in our work, or the work that we read. I think because Shri and I, you know, we live very different lifestyles per se. Like so Shri lives in California, I live in Illinois, and so just the people and the conversations that we're surrounded in are different. So I live in a predominantly Jewish neighborhood. Shri lives in a very diverse neighborhood where there are people in her community that look like her. And so I think both of us really latch onto this concept of identity, me trying to figure out, okay, where do I fit in a broader perspective? Shri taking her current experience and seeing, okay, well, how does this mold me and who I am? And so Anjali and Jetty's work, she wrote Southbound, really resonated with us and probably streamlined this theme of identity, because we saw it kind of pop up in Gold Diggers, which is another book that we reviewed, and we saw it referenced in Unbelonging. And so I think just this general web of like, what does it mean to be South Asian in different communities is like what we latch onto.
And you're like leaning towards the American writers of South Asian heritage, and me and Sabba perhaps like the British ones, which is natural. Like you're just trying to understand yourself, really.
Mm-hmm.
That's a big thing. Do you guys read? Oh, sorry. Do you read like Jhumpa Lahiri? Because I feel like she's like the OG like Indian American writer.
Yeah, you know, like that's a really pertinent question to this, because like as Mishika was saying, because the experience of being South Asian American for us can look so different. So growing up for me in a community that had a lot of South Asian Americans, I actually found like Jhumpa Lahiri was one of the first South Asian writers that I read. And I remember feeling like I'm supposed to relate to this, but I don't quite, because the protagonist in that book grows up in a predominantly white neighborhood, and I didn't. And so a lot of the experiences that they have derived from that were not things that I experienced growing up, but I had like a weirdly more like nuanced version of like the certain practices that like my family did at home maybe like were things that were not talked about in the broader community. And so that made me like a niche within being South Asian. And, you know, like in although we were diverse, I would say that folks from Pakistan or Bangladesh or Sri Lanka were much more of a minority. And so you were assumed to be Indian if you were brown and not from these other South Asian countries. So things like that were it was a much more nuanced take that it took me a while to start finding in literature. Gold Diggers was actually one of those. So I'm from the Bay Area in California, and that's kind of where when I started reading books that were set in the Bay Area, it was like, oh yeah, this is much more my take. Like this is much more specific as to the kinds of pressures that come with Silicon Valley, Bay Area, Asian American communities, like hyper specific. And Jhumpa Lahiri, while I really like her writing and like the style of it and all of that can be lauded, I wouldn't say that it was representative. And I think like through Brown Girl Bookshelf was the first time that I was able to really voice that. Like, I think I sort of fell in line of saying like, yeah, I totally resonate with Jhumpa Lahiri. And then in my head, I was kind of like, no, I don't really. And then as I started talking to people through Brown Girl Bookshelf, especially people from my neighborhood, they were sort of like, oh yeah, like I liked it through some other books. Like I only ever read The Namesake, or I only ever read these few books. And like, did you really relate to that? Like I didn't really. And I was like, yeah, I didn't really. And I think we all sort of bought into that group consensus because we thought we had to. So that has been a really nice part for me of finding the kind of like breadth and depth of South Asian writers through this account.
Yeah, and I will say, oh, sorry, go ahead, Natasha.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, well, Shri, I feel like has found kind of some semblance of like, yes, I can relate to these elements of books. Like I will say I'm still struggling. I identify as Sikh American, and I haven't really picked up a lot of novels per se that have Sikh American leads or protagonists. And so I feel like while I am immersing myself in South Asian work, I'm still struggling to find myself in that South Asian work, which kind of goes back to Ali, your question about Jhumpa, and just I feel like no author will, of course, write or produce content that resonates with everyone. And as we go into these niche categories, it's even harder to find yourself represented in within that. So while we do focus on South Asian work and we review South Asian work, I can't say with, confidence that I've seen myself or my sister or my parents represented in that work. So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done for me to, come to the table and say, yes, I like see myself in that book, or yes, I relate to that author's experiences, because everything looks so different.
It's always, I agree with you there. And I feel similar because I'm of Pakistani heritage, but I'm half Punjabi, half Sindhi. So my parents are cross-cultural marriage. So it's quite rare when I tell people that, oh, and I didn't realize it was a strange thing until I was much older. And so my experience has been quite different to other South Asian kids that I grew up with. And so the kinship that I've found has always been quite fragmented. And so I've learned to settle for pockets of belonging here and there. And that seems to be the best that you can do, especially in stories and in literature. And I think it's one of those things, isn't it? That it's like, well, when you were saying that, I was like, I really want you to write a book that you're in that has you and your mum and your sister in it, or we need to spread the net wider and find more writers from our community. Because I know that Sabba, you are Azad Kashmiri, and you said that you've said before that finding your community within the diaspora, the wider diaspora, through communities like Bookstagram and through online spaces and curated spaces has been something that's quite restorative for you.
Yeah, definitely. And Shri, as you were just talking about your experiences, I think it was just before I'd properly started to dive into my book, I met a poet who is now a very good friend of mine, Shagufta Iqbal. And I met her a few years ago. I think it was an exhibition that there was a group exhibition, and I was showing some of my work, and she was a poet at the opening night of this exhibition called The Beauty of Being British Asian, which is very apt. But that was quite a few years ago now. And we met each other, and I was just like, oh my gosh, your poetry's amazing. She was like, oh my gosh, your artwork's amazing. We're like totally fangirling each other. And she was like, where are your family from Pakistan? And I was like, oh, you know, Azad Kashmir. And, you know, a lot of people don't really know the story. And I was just like, oh gosh, I really don't want to go into this here. And she was like, no, my family too. And I was like, what? No way. And then she was like, whereabouts? And I was like, oh, Mirpur, small town. She was like, yeah, Mirpur. And I was just like, oh, you're like one of my people. And she was like, yeah, you're one of my people. And I was like, and there was this moment where I was just like, I never meet other artists or especially poets or art. Like there was such a strange moment of like, you're from my community, and the only people that I know from my community are my mums and aunties and cousins who've never made it to university, let alone like have gone through to that point where they're now exhibiting in a public space, and you know, all this sort of stuff, all the layers that came with that. And she was just like, oh yeah, that's because most of the Pakistanis are from like Lahore and Karachi. You know, she said something so like flippant and just blasé. And it stayed with me. And I was just like, oh my gosh, there's a real class issue here as well. Who gets to access education? Who gets to make it through to the other side to then tell their story? And it was only through that moment. And I think just sitting on it myself and reflecting on, you know, the kinds of people that I've been around, you know, sort of university adult life onwards, and just the fact that I wasn't really seeing the kinds of people that my home community and my private life are reflective of, that really for me I started to formalize that idea that actually this is a Mirpuri story, this is a Azad Kashmiri / Mirpuri story. And Ali, I'm looking at you and thinking back to when you first saw the press release for my book, and you were like, it says South Asian, Pakistani, Azad Kashmiri, Mirpuri, and like all the labels, all the possible labels. And I was just like, yeah, like actually there's so many ways to label, you know, it's consecutive onion layers, isn't it? It's like the wider blanket of the South Asian. And actually, having said that, I actually recall you were just recently, I think these last 24 hours, you've been putting up some questions on your platform, right? About what's the South Asian category? How do we feel about that? And I haven't responded yet, but
please do. Yeah, I'm glad. I'm glad we're talking about this, because I did want to come to this eventually about, you know, specificity.
How specific and how not, right? And I was just like, I'm just gonna do it all at like every stage. You were like, at the title you say this, and here so at this paragraph you say that.
The press release, yeah, like the press release for Sabba's novel, it says various things all in one page. So that I just noticed that, and I was like, isn't this weird? Like almost, I think it reflected the publishers not really knowing how to market it. So they said, you know, this is a British Asian story. It's the story of a Muslim woman, a Kashmiri woman, a Pakistani woman. And they were like, they probably got confused as well, like, let alone us. So it is interesting, yeah, like the amount of layers that exist. I find it so good, though, that your story, as you said, is like a Mirpuri story, because I think the majority, like the Pakistani community here, is from there originally, right?
Mirpuri, yeah.
I hadn't seen the word Mirpur in literature until the last few years. So like it's emerging now that people are, I guess I'm not from that background, so I don't know, but it feels like people are claiming it now a lot more.
Yeah.
So that's interesting.
And that's amazing.
And yeah, like on my story today, I just posted, yeah, like what does South Asian mean? Is it a useful term? And I'm interested to hear what everyone thinks, because it is such a broad idea, isn't it? And do we have things in common? You know, people on this call are from Pakistan and India originally, but we do fit under that umbrella. So just to get a bit meta and like question the whole idea of what it means. But no, it is interesting, because how do we use labels? What do they mean to us?
It's an interesting one, isn't it? And it's a really bizarre one. I mean, I remember when we used to just call ourselves Asian, because in Britain that's what we used to say, and now we're moving more towards South Asian. But in the work with South Asian Heritage Month, I now feel more it feels more natural to me to say I'm half Sindhi, half Punjabi, and that's what comes out. But never before in my life have I felt natural and comfortable in saying that. Not that I ever felt uncomfortable. It just wasn't something that I felt needed saying. And now it's just this urgent blurt out of your mouth, needs to be said. And I find that rather fantastic.
It's like you're getting even more specific, even as this wider term emerges. And you guys said, Brown Girl Bookshelf. I did want to ask about the word brown there, because what does that, like, why did you decide to go for that word, and what does that include for you guys?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, actually, I don't had that. I had an answer to your previous question, or just like a thought to add in there. Maybe Mishka, if you want to chime in about the second one. The previous question to like different identity, I think like for me, it's like an interesting mix, because I think there is some amount of danger, is maybe a harsh word, but some amount of danger of getting like too specific, because then I think like it can be more polarizing. And as Mishka said, like she and I are from very different backgrounds. And so in some ways it is nice to identify that, but then also find a way to, even if it's not common links, like just continue to be, I guess, open-minded. It gets challenging when I think there are the like contrasts are within the South Asian community. And to be like specific on that, like when I was saying like growing up, Jhumpa Lahiri's work in like a predominantly South Asian community didn't resonate, but there were other things that were difficult for me. Like I am South Indian. And so being South Indian in the Bay Area, while it's like predominantly South Indian, there was this weird culture growing up of it being like, people didn't talk about South Asian traditions, and they only kind of talked about North Indian traditions, or South Indian traditions. And like, that was it's a weird contrast to make, because it sort of pits groups within this umbrella against each other, when that is not really the direction I want to head with that. But there was some amount of like shame that I carried associated with being like Tamilian and South Indian, more than I carried with being like Indian. And so like it has been particularly fulfilling to find books that are reflecting that. Like I was just reading S.J. Sindhu's new book called Blue Skinned Gods, and I was like reading it with Mishika next to me, and I kept leaning over and being like, I've never seen this word in a book. Like I didn't think that this Tamil word would ever be written in a book without even like the explanation on what it was. Like it was just a really beautiful moment of like, I thought only my family ever said that word. So to see that in writing was really special in a way that I haven't found other books to be. But I do think like I still sort of like the umbrella, because getting too hyper specific for me tends to be like too polarizing in some ways. I'm still trying to find that balance. So that's sort of my thoughts around that larger umbrella. I think it's important. I think there's a broader conversation around South Asians as a culture versus, but like compared to the rest of the world. But then there's like these divisions within that too that can be tricky. So that's my comment around that. Mishka, I don't know if you had something about his other.
Yeah. I think Shri indirectly answered that question as well, about like why brown. I mean, we could have easily said like South Asian girl bookshelf, or we could have said like Sikh and Hindu girl bookshelf, like really specifying our origins and like how we identify. But in all, transparency, when we started Brown Girl Bookshelf, we started with the intention of, yes, focusing on some South Asian work, but really kept it umbrella, like let's do all BIPOC, because I read a lot of work by Black authors, and I was like, I'm not going to stop reading this work. Let's just feature it on BGB. But we noticed that those that were following along with us and engaging with our work were primarily those that wanted more work by authors like Anjali Anjeti and authors like SJ. And so we were like, let's just narrow in and only feature this sort of work with maybe sprinkles of other material that we're reading. But I think Brown just kind of provided us with like the safety net of featuring any author that we felt like identified as Brown. So kind of keeping it like umbrella and vague was in our best interest.
I think that makes sense. We have a couple of comments coming in here. So from YouTube, we have someone saying, I'm so grateful that Bookstagrammers exist. It makes me feel less isolated. And then on Facebook, I agree, you feel less isolated and it gives you more confidence when you see others doing the same. And then we have a question from Sazvor on Facebook, and she says, your discussion is really enlightening. How do we convince a wider publishing industry to find our representation? It's a big question. That is a big question.
I feel like Sabba would know, having gone through it. Or at least, what was your experience with, pitching the idea and getting a publisher on board?
Yeah, I think I don't know.
I'll put you on the spot there.
Yeah, you put me on the spot. I think for
Sorry.
me, it was a combination of the fact that I was bringing a lot of my architectural stuff into it, and it's a graphic novel, so it's not just straight literature either. There's already a niche within a niche, and I think I really like exploring these nesting dolls. So Ali, you were saying that earlier on, you said that perhaps the different labels that we've used in the press release is a reflection of the fact that the publisher doesn't know how to pitch me, but I think it's also a reflection of the way I operate as well, and the fact that I really enjoy blurring boundaries and actually being part of a bigger whole, but then also just being super specific as well, and just the gradations between those different scales. So I think the fact that mine is a graphic novel, the fact that it's an indie publisher as well, they're not a huge, massive publisher. The fact that when I submitted my piece, it was for a competition. So every 2 years, the publisher does a competition to cast the net and see and search for new voices, people who haven't published before, who are looking to publish. Graphic novels are also notoriously underpaid. So they take years and years and years, and they don't make a lot of money because they're so niche. It's very hard to sell them as well because they're quite expensive. So my book is 288 pages of full color print, and it's nearly £20. And
worth it. Buy it. It's excellent.
Yeah, it is worth it. But then it goes in like 2 hours, right? You can like finish it in 2 hours. It takes 5 years. There's all these things, and I think that's where for me, yeah, it comes with a gold print. It's thank you. So that,
yes,
thanks, guys.
Everybody hold up the roles we play, and you can play the roles we play at home as well.
Yeah, you can sense that I'm going into self-deprecating mode there.
Absolutely brilliant. It was a beautiful piece of work.
But I think convincing industry, for me, I think again, coming from architecture that's so establishment and so hierarchical and so white man rules the freaking world, I was just like, screw you guys. I found this little indie publisher and they're going to let me do what I want. That's awesome. And I had, when the book was launching, when I'd completed it 5 years on, they had a whole list of people that they were going to send it to. So the big establishment names they were going to send it to, the main newspapers, BBC, The Guardian, all that. And I knew that that was covered. And then they came to me and they said, you've got a handful of books that you should send to the people that you want to send to. And who are those people? And for me, and this is where I think, Natasha, you were like, Sabba, you should come onto this panel talk. Because for me, it was really my peers and the people that I look at on my social media platforms, and who I'm inspired by, who for me are like on the edge of, radical thinking, fresh thinking, new thinking, and are really pushing boundaries. And I was just like, so for me, my biggest success was the fact that I contacted the brown hijabi, Suhaima Manzoor. She's like a huge idol in my eyes. I absolutely love her. I love her work. I love everything that she says, and she's so on point and incredible. And I've seen her perform a lot, totally fangirl her all the time. And I messaged her and I said, hey, do you want one of my free copies of my book? I hope you like it, but if you don't, that's totally cool. And if you don't want to review it, that's totally cool. There were just so many caveats of like, I might be absolutely shit and you might just look at it and be like, you're awful. I don't want anything to do with you. So there's all of that. And she was like, hey, okay, fine, cool. So then I posted it to her. And then like a day after the book was launched, she posted this beautiful review of it. And it just felt so validating, and it felt so incredibly powerful to be seen by someone who I absolutely admire and am completely in awe of and inspired by, to validate my work. And then I was just like, this is nothing. Like, this is, The Guardian is nothing on this. Like, yeah, okay, I could get like an amazing review somewhere else, but this is the stuff that I'm seeking, and this is what's giving me belonging, and it's making me feel good about my work. And I think that's the kind of way that I've gone about it. And I think that's all because I've come from this place where I've just got rejected loads, and I'm just like, actually, I'm not even seeking that approval now. I'm seeking approval from the people that I see myself in, and that I relate to, that I connect to. yeah, I don't know if
That's
that
an
answers that.
incredibly powerful thing. No, I can hear it. Don't be self-deprecating. That was brilliant. You're brilliant. It's an incredibly powerful thing, because it literally is like starting from an idea and starting from a place where you are, as curators of these communities, where you're like, okay, well, I really enjoyed this book. I'm going to talk about it. And I'm maybe going to store things here so I can decolonize my bookshelf. People getting inspired by that, people jumping on board with that, and then that goes all the way along to one of those members of your audience is a fantastic author themselves that wants to see themselves reflected in the world back at them, and then wants their book reflected back through the people. It's a really beautiful. This is the language of belonging, and this is how we find belonging. In this canon of post-colonial legacy, it is interpersonal. It is between people, and it is experience. It's no longer land-based, because our land was fractured, and so we find it in these spaces with each other. And I think it's such a powerful, lovely thing. Oh, hang on a second. We've got another one from YouTube. How open do you feel the publishing industry is to printing stories that go beyond those which the publishers feel will sell to their predominantly white market? Great session, by the way. That's that's a toughie.
Meshika and I talk about this a lot. I think like when we started doing this, I initially felt like, oh wow, there's a lot more books by South Asian authors than I ever really like knew myself. And then it felt like, oh, there's actually a lot. Like it feels like we're probably represented like pretty well. Like as Meshika said, there were identities that still needed to be. But then it was sort of like, there was an article that the New York Times put out that analyzed the top books sold in the US and published in the US in like the last 50 years or something. I might be getting those numbers wrong. It came out last fall, and it was overwhelmingly white male authors who were being published, who were in the top lists. And that, when you look at it kind of statistically, was really eye-opening as to like how far still, in terms of just pure numbers wise, representation needed to happen. And then when you looked into like why that was a need, as Meshika said, there were stories like hers and her family's which were still not represented. But I think like I still want to identify that there is a problem that exists still with like what people expect South Asian stories to look like. And we really try to be critical as to like how much of it frankly falls under like trauma porn, of just like putting out all of our pain out there, like all of the possible things that they think people of color are supposed to be experiencing, and kind of capitalizing on that. And it's not to say that we don't have difficult stories, but there are also stories that like we've read a few books that have been so refreshing, especially as we're like constantly reading these, that are just like, they don't actually just touch on the ways that being a child of an immigrant has affected you, but like The Startup Wife by Tamima Mom was like just about like this woman who is working in the tech industry, and like romance novels cover that in a very different way. And then I think there are other really thoughtful ways of including trauma, but not making it the like driving force of everything that protagonists or everything the characters do. A Passage North was a great example of that for me, where it was like a very like philosophical book that touches on anyone's life, whether or not they experience the kind of trauma that the character encounters in his world as being like a country, Sri Lanka, fragmented by a civil war. And that to me are like thoughtful ways of doing that. I think it's still a problem of like, that's what people expect South Asian books to feature. And then when they're not, they're kind of like, this was an okay book, or not as interested in it. And I do get frustrated by that. I think that's still a problem of the kinds of book that then get chosen to be published as well.
I agree. I think it's long been very polarized. I think there are two versions of us that have been allowed to exist and two stories that have been allowed to be told. And it's the trauma porn, like you say, and or the my culture is so backward and it's persecuting me, and I'm gonna dye my hair ridiculous colors and pierce everything and trash on it. Or it's the very romanticized colonial dancing in the rain, smelling of saffron, that bizarre, fragile view of South Asian femininity, or, you know, that very sort of white savior type story, which is very, very odd. And within that, all of the space in between gets lost, and it doesn't allow for all of the iterations of us that exist outside of those two very bizarre paradigms. And I think we're slowly moving towards a shift in that perception of us, but it starts with things like this, because I don't think people realize quite how much of the work is out there already. People don't realize how many fantastic, amazing crime writers we have in our community, particularly in Britain. So many. Simon Meyer, for example, right here, she's brilliant. Like, and A. Don, for example, very, very good. But, and this is the thing, and these people, Simon Meyer's book, We Can't, I'm pointing at it, we can't see it, I'm so sorry. It's already been optioned for a BBC series already. It's just come out. It's high caliber writing, and it's not brown writing, it's not South Asian writing, it's understanding how having different strands to your identity can fold itself into storytelling, and what the value of that is. And to answer your question about how we can make these stories sort of fit the market, as it were, I think the perception around what South Asian stories are is there is a deficit in that understanding, and the deficit being you see them as this monolith of this chocolate monolith of like this is a homogenous blob, whatever genre, whatever emotion, whatever story you are writing into, we see it as brown. Whereas what I see, and what I think we've all been collectively experiencing in decolonizing our bookshelves when we're reading from different writers, from different worldviews, from all over the world, is that it's not about, oh, I'm going to learn about Nigeria today, and Nigerian writers write like this. It's not about that. It's about understanding how all of the incredible strands of identity fold and weave together and inform storytelling and make it richer and make it more exciting and inform more complete and interesting characters. And when you know what that interplay looks like and you work in publishing, my God, you can commission some exciting work, some really, really exciting work, and still house it under the same genres that exist already. And those people can all be different colors, and you don't have to market it as what their ethnicity is. And I think the deficit is with the disconnect is the understanding around what that actually means when you are BIPOC and you're just trying to tell a story.
Yeah, and I would even add that like storytelling has so many different forms, right? So, like Sabba's on the line with graphic novels. I mean, that is talent, multifaceted talent that we should just acknowledge beyond just letters or words on a page, right? That's beautiful illustration. That's a different medium of storytelling. I saw that with Manjeet Thop's Feelings. I'm seeing it right now as I look at Mira Jacobs' Good Talk that's on my shelf. And so it's one thing to acknowledge that there are fantastic writers in our community, but they are more than writers. They tell stories in different ways that need to be sold. And so just buying into a different form of storytelling, such as graphic novels, does wonders for our community, because you're essentially saying to publishers that we will read this material because we support this material. We acknowledge that it's innovative, it's unique, it's fun. And so I think that's something that Brown Girl Bookshelf has even compelled me to do. I'd never read a graphic novel prior to starting BGB, and now I've read 3. And so the more we can kind of engage our communities to do so, the better it is for the wider audience.
I agree. I think that's wonderful.
I think
sorry, go on.
Sorry, Natasha. I just wanted to add that I think also for me, I definitely started from a very niche point, my Mewbury heritage and reflecting my stuff. But there's so many other facets to my identity. You know, I did architecture. I was within a white middle class, upper class profession for so many years. And for me, I think it was really one of the most powerful things that came out of the BLM movement was this sudden call to reckoning of the responsibility of the white majority in the US and the UK, and the responsibility that they have in integrating themselves into a multiplicity, multiple identity community, I guess. And I think there's I'm describing it really badly, but I think there's a real, we're having conversations around, you know, like literature for brown people and literature for black people, and you know, I would read literature that's by a brown person because I'm a brown person. But I think there really needs to be a shift, and I think it's starting to happen because of last year's BLM shift. Actually, white people need to be reading black literature and brown literature, and actually that's where the shift needs to happen. So we're writing it for ourselves first and foremost, but actually those guys need to be picking up our books, and exactly as you guys are saying, it needs to be integrated into the wider bookstore and not just be cornered as the, like, you know, the ethnic writing corner.
And curriculum as well.
Yeah, I was going to say similar to answer, like, I think Harinder's question about the publishing industry. I think there's sometimes maybe scared of the specific, and they think that will only be for a certain audience, whereas we need to recognize that these are just it's good writing and it's good drawing, and anyone can read it. There's so much in Sabba's novel that's just about life in general, and I think anyone can benefit from reading it. So we have to get past the misconception that, you know, like, only South Asian people are going to read South Asian stories.
Exactly.
There's a lot that's universal, and as we've all said now as well, just kind of embedding it into the main body of literature as well. I think that's how to do it.
100%. I mean, ultimately you're writing from the personal, but it's about universality as well of human experience, and I think that's why so many people connect with your work, Sabba. Really, there's so many of my friends are obsessed with your Instagram account and also your book, quite rightly as well, because it is so utterly humanizing. And you have this, you know, how you were saying you were talking about the oh, for goodness sake, the nesting doll, so that you'd like to center things and then also play that, the interplay between the way that you do that, the two things of making things completely specific and then moving outwards. It's so utterly skillful, and that's why I think your work walks that line so perfectly, in that you are so specifically talking about aspects of the South Asian diaspora, but there is such a universality to your experience and such a relatability that friends of mine who have absolutely no idea what it is like to grow up the way that you grew up or that we grew up have this instant affinity with what you're saying and what you're putting down on the page, and it's a really powerful thing, an absolutely powerful thing. And then so much of that is obviously to do with your talent as a writer, but what I love is that a vehicle within this process has been having a platform to share and ultimately you have to bare your soul to do it. These are very, very intimate parts of yourself that you're sharing, but it's such a privilege for people to be able to engage with you on that level. And that's why communities like this, I think, are so important for creative spaces, for creative artists, for people who are signposting us to where the work is when there are writers from our community doing the work, showing us where they are. One thing I would really like to ask, because I'm mindful of time, so I realise we've got to close shortly. One thing I would like to ask both Mashika and Shri and Ali as well is that, and Ali, you and I have spoken about this before, but we have an official book list for South Asian Heritage Month for the literature programme this year that is going in our literary pack, that is going to schools and libraries and councils and bookshops up and down the country, because I have a lot of conversations with them, and a lot of them need to and want to update their bookshelves, and they're keen to engage with all of this. I would absolutely love it if you could curate a book list of your recommendations for us. I would love that, because the things that the authors that you were talking about, the stories that you were talking about as well, it'd be so interesting to hear your favorite picks as well from an American perspective, but also the female perspective. And Ali, I would love a curated book list from you. lengthwise, whatever you feel comfortable with, and then I will include it in our pack and in our weekly emails. And as people get in touch with us from those bodies up and down the country, I will put your recommendations in there, because ultimately it is the kids in schools that want to read this stuff. It is the kids in schools that want to know where you are, where they can find you, and they want some solid advice about what they should be reading. And you are trusted people in these spaces to young minds and young ears and young hearts. And that's really what this is about. And it's a lovely, lovely thing. So where can we follow you? How can we stalk you? Tell us before we have to go.
Yeah, well, first and foremost, thank you again for hosting this and having us as a part of this discussion. I had never connected with Sabba and Ali before, so lovely to speak with both of you and have such candid conversations. For those listening, you can find us at Brown Girl Bookshelf on Instagram. You can find us at Brown G Bookshelf on Twitter. Our website is www.browngirlbookshelf.com. And then we also have a newsletter on Substack. So if you're on our Instagram, we have like a quick link section that you can just access, and it'll route you to all of our different resources and web pages. So thanks again. And yeah, that's all from us.
And Sabba, where can we stalk you? Oh, I'm so sorry, Ali. Sorry. I'm so sorry.
Sorry, Sabba. Yeah, so at South Asian Book Club on Instagram, that's the only place. I don't have a Substack.
Cool. You can find me mostly on Instagram, and my handle is Sabba Khan Art, just my name, and on Twitter, Sabba Khan _, but I'm less active on Twitter. And I also have a website that I've been updating, and the website is the place where I'm putting in all of the reviews and all the things that are happening for the book, but also any up and coming things that are happening as well. So 3 places to check out. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, guys. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I'm so happy that you could join us for this discussion.
Thank you.
So much.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having us.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us. We hope you have a really nice evening. Bye.
Bye.